proper way to solder these is you want to actually hold the hot iron, resting it on the pin and the board junction right there momentarily, and then you want to feed your solder in at the other side of the pin so that the pin gets hot enough to melt the solder, and you don't want to overheat it. The common mistake people make that don't solder for a living or aren't very good at it is they tend to lose their patience for waiting for the solder to melt, and they tend to feed the solder directly to the tip of the iron. And what ends up happening is you end up melting the solder, and it just ends up making these blobs that kind of may or may not stick to the pin, and you think that you've got, it's soldered, but what you've got is the potential for what we call a cold solder joint. That's a solder joint that it's kind of like a bad weld, where but the difference is not only is it not a good mechanical connection, but it's a poor electrical connection also. So that's why you got to be careful about that. Oh, one other thing, the type of solder you want to use is the type of solder for electronics. Typically it's what they call rosin core, and it's typically, I believe, 60-40 tin lead is the composition. That's what I've always used in electronics. Maybe now they use a lead-free substitute. Alright, so I've soldered these two, and now I've done this one, and I left this one out. I just wanted to pause for a moment and talk about how when I soldered this first pin, after I initially soldered it, what I did was I pushed up on the capacitor and reflowed the solder so that the capacitor fully seated up against the board, because of gravity tends to make it want to hang down. I wanted to make sure they're fully seated. Then once I've done that, now I know that it's going to stay put because this one's holding it up, so now I can flow that one. The other step that you didn't see me doing while I was soldering is periodically I go over to my sponge and I wipe the tip in my damp sponge, cleaning the tip. And that's an important step during soldering to keep contaminants out of your solder and out of your connection. So there we go. Now, if I was a real professional, I'd do one last step, and that's I'd clean up this flux off the board with some cleaner and a small tooth. I usually use an old toothbrush, but I don't have that handy, and it's getting late. I really want to get this thing fired back up, hopefully. So without further ado, we're going to reinstall the board. Alright, taking care to ensure that none of the plugs inadvertently got underneath the board. I wiggled the board into position over the 3 standoffs, and now I just gently press down right near the standoff, and just like that it's locked back in. Now I'm going to reinstall my screws. Of course, we got 3 regular screws with washers there. This screw right here was the one with the large plastic washer, and this screw and this screw are the ones with star washers. Alright, we've got the last of the screws in, so now we install our plugs, and of course we have 5 of them. First, the AC input. Then down here we have this one, which is also a locking plug. Then we have 3 push-on plugs. This one here. Of course, you got to be real careful you don't bend a pin in the process of snapping these back in, but you also want to make sure it's seated firmly, and you don't want to push down on the board to a point where you can actually crack the board. And what do we got? We got 2 more. There's this one here. And last but not least, we have that one right there. The good thing is these only go on one way. You can't invert them. So if you're trying to put them on and you're having a really hard time, make sure you didn't invert it. Okay, so our power supply board is reinstalled. Now let's put in our SDRU board. Alright, so we have this anti-static bag that this board was shipped in, so that indicates that this board may be the type of board that is susceptible to damage through electrostatic discharge. That means that that's the type of board that actually the static from your body can actually damage a component on the board. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of precaution, that has to do with the anti-static precautions. So I have a wrist strap that I can wear, and basically it's a strap that goes around your wrist, and it's got a little metal button that contacts your body. It's got a little wire, and then on the other end there's an alligator clip, and what you do is you ground that alligator clip, and that keeps your body grounded, so that makes it safe to handle these types of devices. You can also do the same thing by simply touching the chassis ground on the whatever you're working on. Like oftentimes if it's a computer, you just grab the case of the power supply or the metal frame, and that will ground you. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to take my screws out. I put them here for safekeeping so I wouldn't lose them. And as soon as I get these screws out, we'll install the board by simply gently slipping it into this connector on the Y-sus board. Now this board is advertised as a good used board. I think it's actually a refurbished board, because if I were a betting man, I would say this buffer IC right here was replaced. If you notice, this buffer IC, the goop that they flow around the edge of it here to conceal the leads of the flat pack type IC looks very different than the other ones. The other ones are pretty uniform, like they were done at the factory, and then that one's just kind of squirrely. So I'd say somebody replaced that buffer IC to do a repair on this particular unit. So now I have to insert these ribbon cables. Now this is tricky. You want to do this very gently because you don't want to damage them. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to flip up these plastic covers right here, and that releases the little clamping device that actually puts pressure on these, and then we just slide this in gingerly until we feel it just fully seat, and then we flip this down. I'm going to do this with 2 fingers, 2 hands. So there you go. It looks like it's all the way in. If you don't get these seated correctly, what can happen is you'll get strange lines on the screen, and then you can undo this and try and reseat them to correct that. I did notice somebody online who did this repair and is a actual technician at a TV shop. He pointed out that he had discovered that oftentimes in the past they had just, while the set was running, undid these plugs and reseated these and plugged them back in again to correct the lines problem while the set was running. And he noticed that one time he was doing that, in the process of having the set running and unplugging and plugging in this ribbon cable, one of these ribbon cables actually ended up damaging the one of the buffer ICs on the SDU board, so the SDR board. So he actually cautioned against that. Now, just like that, I believe our repair is done. The question is it a successful repair? Well, let's find out. Okay, I already got my standby power switch in the on position, so now I'm just going to plug the set in. Not getting standby power. Oh, my extension cord is unplugged from the wall. I wonder who did that. There we go. Standby power is on. Grab our remote. Oh no. Shucks. This was not a successful repair. That's a shame. Well, just for giggles, I unplugged the SDR D board. Even though that one tested good, that's one I haven't replaced. Of course, the IR receivers. Oh, there we go. Well, that's interesting. It seems to be staying on. Let's stand it up and see what we've got for a raster. Well, what we've got is we've got the top raster, and then I was going to power saving because there's no signal present. But it's not shutting off because of a power supply problem. It's shutting off just because there's no signal present. That's interesting. I can get the main menu to come up, but I can't get the input menu to show up. And I notice when the main menu is up, I can't select channel manager. That's weird. I'm gonna have to admit defeat here, I think. I could get the SDR D board, but that's another $75 to blow, and there's no guarantee that's gonna fix the problem.